There are many approaches to managing state or data in web applications. Redux has become a very popular option, but in my opinion, using Redux requires too much code. In this screencast, I'll walk through an application that uses Redux in the most common way, and then show how it can be simplified. The sample application creates greeting card content. It is a single-page web app created with Create React App. The user can select an occasion, enter a person's name, enter a message, shout the message, which makes it all uppercase, and display the card content. A version of this application that uses the standard Redux approach can be found at the URL on the screen. Let's run through it. For name, I'll enter Tammy. For message, I'll enter have some chocolate cake. And then I'm going to press the shout button, which makes that message all uppercase. Then press the show card button, which will show me that card content. Then I can click the back button to go back and enter different content and generate a different card. Looking at the bottom of the browser, you see that I have the Redux DevTools opened. And this gives me a log of all of the actions that have been dispatched so far. And so if I click the last one, I see that what has happened is that I have changed the value of show in the state from card to form. And I can click the Action tab on the right and see exactly what was in that action object, the type of it and the payload. And then I can click the State tab and see exactly what's in my state right now. But even better for debugging purposes is that I can replay all the actions that have been dispatched so far. And so starting from where I am, I can click this left pointing angle in the lower right, and that takes me back one action. And the UI updates to show me what it looked like at that point. And I can continue doing that and step backwards, in this case taking one character at a time off of the message. So that's a really great debugging tool. Let's review the implementation of this app. First, let's look at the file index.js. This file was generated by Create React App and modified. It configures the use of Redux DevTools on lines 10 and 11. It defines the initial state on lines 13 through 18. It creates the Redux store on line 20, associating it with the reducer function, which we will see next. This file renders the app component on line 24 wrapped in a provider element, which enables use of the Redux React package. Redux React makes it easy for components to gain access to parts of the state and dispatch actions to change it. Next, let's look at reducer.js. It defines action type constants on lines 2 through 6. It defines action creator functions on lines 10 through 32. These functions create and return action objects with a specific type and payload. It defines a reducer function on lines 34 through 50. That takes the current state and an action object. It contains a switch statement that switches on action type. Each case returns a new state object without modifying the current state. Note how in all of these cases the object spread operator is used to create a new state object that only differs from the current state by a single property value. While only differing by one property value is not always the case, it is very common. In typical applications, I'd say 90% of the reducer switch cases do this. Next, let's look at app.js. This was generated by Create React App and modified. It defines the app component on lines 7 through 20. It utilizes the Redux React package to export a connected component on line 27 that uses map state to props to obtain the show property from the state and make it available to the app component as a prop. It determines whether to render the form or the card component based on the show prop on line 10. This is a very simple alternative to a more full-featured routing solution like React Router, but it is sufficient for many applications. This component always renders a header followed by a form or card component. Next, let's look at form.js. This imports action creator functions from reducer.js on lines 3 through 9. It utilizes the Redux React package to export a connected component on line 78. And that uses map state to props on lines 73 to 76 to obtain the message, name, and occasion properties from state and makes them available to the form component as props. It uses map dispatch to props on lines 55 to 71 to define functions that dispatch actions returned by action creator functions and makes these functions available to the form component as props. The render method on lines 13 through 50 renders a select component for selecting an occasion, an input element for entering a person's name, a text area for entering a message, a button for shouting the message, and finally a button for switching to rendering the card component instead of this component. Finally, let's look at card.js. This imports the setShowActionCreator function from reducer.js on line 3. It utilizes the Redux React package to export a connected component on line 54 that uses map state to props on lines 49 to 52 to obtain the message, name, and occasion properties from the state and makes them available to the card component as props. It uses map dispatch to props on lines 43 to 47 to define the showForm function that dispatches a show action returned by the setShowActionCreator function and makes this function available to the card component as a prop. The render method on lines 19 through 38 renders an image for the selected occasion, the greeting, the message, and a button for switching to rendering the form component instead of this component. While this application is not complicated, there are lots of pieces used in order to manage state with Redux. Think about the steps required to support a new action. For each new action, we must add a new action type constant, write an action creator function that creates an action object of a specific type and has the appropriate payload, where the payload is just the data needed to update the state. Modify the switch statement in a reducer function to handle the new action type by building a new state that incorporates the action payload. Write an event handling function in each component that will dispatch the action. Register the event handling function so it will be invoked at the appropriate time. For example, this might happen when a user presses a button or changes an input. And finally, possibly add new properties to the object that defines the initial state for the application. That's a lot of steps. Now that we've seen the typical way in which Redux is used, let's see what we can do to simplify things. I have primarily used React over the last few years and have created a library that simplifies the use of Redux. It's called Redux Easy and can be found in NPM at the URL on the screen. Redux Easy uses the Redux and React Redux NPM packages under the covers. A version of the sample app that uses this simpler approach to state management can be found at the URL on the screen. The goals we want to achieve are the following. It should be easy to specify the state properties used by each component, whose changes should cause a component to re-render. Components should get state property values as props in a simple manner. It should be easy to replace the current state with new state. It should be easy to retrieve the current state. It should be easy to write and register functions that derive a new state by applying changes to the current state, and such functions should be usable by multiple components. It should be easy to use Redux DevTools in a browser to view the current and past states, see a log of all requested state changes and the diffs they caused, replay state changes backward and forward, and see the resulting UI changes. This is known as time travel debugging. Finally, state should survive browser refreshes, and the UI should re-render correctly. All of these goals are achieved by Redux Easy. Let's review a version of the sample app that has the same functionality, but uses Redux Easy to reduce the amount of code required. First, let's look at index.js. Like the previous version, this file was generated by Create React App and modified and defines the initial state. However, the remaining code is all replaced by a single call on line 19 to the Redux setup function provided by Redux Easy. This takes care of configuring the use of Redux DevTools, creating the Redux store, associating it with the reducer function that it supplies, and rendering a specific component, app in this case, inside a provider element to enable the use of the Redux React package. This is much simpler. Next, let's look at reducer.js. This version of the app does not need to define action type constants or action creator functions, and it doesn't define a reducer function with a switch statement. Instead, it relies on a provided reducer function. For simple actions, no custom code is needed. For complex actions, the add reducer function can be passed an action type name and a function to be invoked whenever that action type is dispatched. This function will be passed the current state and an optional payload. It returns the new state without modifying the current state. As the comment at the bottom explains, the call to add reducer on lines 3 to 6 is not really needed in this case because the dispatch transform function described later can be used instead. Next, let's look at app.js. Like the previous version, this file was generated by create React app and modified. It defines the app component on lines 7 through 20. The render method is identical. The way it gets the show property is different. The watch function called on line 22 is provided by Redux Easy. It takes a component and a map from property names to state paths. It returns a connected component for the component passed to it, app in this case. Property names that match the state path can be specified as an empty string. An example where this wouldn't be the case is if a property named zip was to be obtained from the state path user.address.zipcode. In that case, the map would be what you see on the screen. Next, let's look at form.js. This file differs substantially from the previous version. It utilizes components provided by Redux Easy to simplify associating form elements with their current value, event handling, and action dispatching. The provided components used here are select, input, and text area. Other components that are provided but not required in this app are radio buttons and checkboxes. Additional UI components for selecting colors and a favorite flavor have been added to this version of the sample app just to demonstrate these components. See lines 19 to 28, which define the checkboxes and radio buttons. Also see lines 53 to 58, where those are rendered. The radio buttons component takes a state path and an array of objects that specify the text and value for each radio button. The initially selected radio button is the one whose value matches the initial state value for the specified path. When the user selects a different radio button, the value at its state path is changed to the value of that radio button. The checkboxes component takes an array of objects that specify the text and state path for each checkbox. Checkboxes are initially selected if their state path is initially set to true. When the user checks or unchecks a checkbox, the value at its state path is changed to true or false. The provided components handle state interaction, so the form component does not need to be a connected component. Note how the select, input, and text area components on lines 34, 42, and 46 all take a path prop. This specifies the state path from which to obtain their current value and the state path that should be updated if the user changes the value. The shout button on line 47 has an on-click prop that refers to the shout method on line 14. This method uses the provided dispatch function to dispatch a shout action that happens to not require a payload. The show card button on line 51 has an on-click prop that refers to the show card method on line 16. This method uses the provided dispatch set function to dispatch an @set action that changes a given state path to a given value by using the typical Redux pattern where the current state is replaced by new state. In this case, the state prop show is changed to card. Both of these actions appear in Redux DevTools just like in ordinary Redux usage. Finally, let's look at card.js. The render method on lines 21 to 35 in this component is the same as in the previous version, but the way it obtains props from state differs. This uses the provided watch function on line 38 that we saw in app.js. Note how easily we can specify mapping of state paths to props. Like in Form.js, the back button on line 32 has an onClick prop that refers to the showForm method on line 19. This method also uses the provided dispatch set function. In this case, the state prop show is changed to form. Let's run the new version of the app and see the actions that are dispatched in Redux DevTools. I'll select Valentine's Day for the occasion, enter the name Tammy. For the message, I'll enter looking forward to dinner. Then I'll click the Show Card button. We see our greeting card content. I'll click back so that we can exercise the checkboxes and radio buttons. So I'll deselect red, select green and blue, and then change the flavor from vanilla to strawberry. Let's take a look at what appears in the Redux DevTools after exercising this version of the application. I see on the left all of the actions that have been dispatched, and the last one was @set followed by a space and the state path that was being set. And I can see over on the right that the diff that caused was to change favorite flavor from van to straw, abbreviations for those flavors. Then I can click on the Action tab and see the actual action object that was dispatched, and you see that the payload contains the path in the state that I want to change, and then the value that I need to change it to. And then if I look at the state, I can see that sure enough, the favorite flavor has changed to straw, and I see all of the rest of my state. And just like before, I can use time travel debugging at the bottom here, and I can click on that left pointing angle and keep clicking that and go backwards through the state of my UI. And I can scroll back and click on a particular action and then see, well, what was that action and what difference did it cause to my state? In the sample app, we saw usage of dispatch and dispatch set functions provided by Redux Easy. There are more dispatch functions. Dispatch delete dispatches an @delete action that deletes the state at a given path. For example, we could call dispatch delete and pass it the path user.lastname. Dispatch transform dispatches an @transform action that transforms the value of the state at a path. It takes a path and a function. The function is passed the current value at that path and returns the new value. For example, we could call dispatch transform and pass it the path game.score and then a function that takes the current score and adds 1 to it. Dispatch push dispatches an @push action that appends elements to an array. It takes a path to an array and any number of values to be appended. For example, we could call dispatch push, pass it the path paint.colors, and then the values red, green, and blue, and they would be appended to whatever is currently in that array. Dispatch filter dispatches an @filter action that filters elements in an array. It is useful for deleting elements. It takes a path to an array and a function. The function is passed each element in the array and should return true for elements to be retained and false for elements to be deleted. For example, we could call dispatch filter, pass it the path paint.colors, and a function that takes the current color and returns true if the color is not green to remove the color green from that array. Finally, dispatch map dispatches an @map action that modifies the elements in an array. It takes a path to an array and a function. The function is passed each array element and should return the new array element value. For example, we could call dispatch map, pass it the path game.scores, and then a function that takes a score and returns that score multiplied by 2 to double all the scores in an array. In summary, I really love how using Redux Easy reduces the amount of code that must be written to use Redux without losing its primary benefits. For me, this even feels a bit easier than using React's context API. I've successfully used this on 4 projects and am convinced that it's the best way to manage web app state. A potential downside of this approach is that hard-coded state paths will be scattered through the code. If the shape of the state tree changes, all those paths will need to be revisited and possibly modified. However, I think this is a small price to pay for the simplifications that Redux Easy provides, and the shape of the state tree for an application typically doesn't change very often. For more detail, see my May 2018 article at the URL on the screen. Feel free to share your thoughts on this approach. You can email me at r.mark.volkman@gmail.com, or leave comments as issues in the GitHub repo for Redux Easy. Thanks for watching.